Ever had someone rob you blind? Not of cash, not of groceries, but of raw power itself? That's the nightmare I found myself living. Every night, something was off. My system was bleeding energy, draining faster than it should, like some unseen parasite was latched onto my grid. At first, I chalked it up to a malfunction, maybe a dying battery cell, maybe the inverter was acting up. But when I finally uncovered the truth, the anger that hit me was volcanic. Because it wasn't a glitch at all. It was deliberate. Someone was siphoning electricity from my solar setup, juicing up their fancy electric car on my dime, and assuming I was too clueless to catch on. And the kicker? It wasn't a stranger skulking around in the dark. It was the neighborhood enforcer, the self-appointed compliance officer from our HOA. You know the type. The guy who struts up and down the block in his wannabe security vest, throwing around rules no one ever agreed to follow. Before I get into how this all went down, drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'm curious how far this story will spread. The early warnings were barely noticeable. My lights would dim for no reason. The backup batteries would drain twice as fast. And, inexplicably, my utility bill rose when it should have been shrinking. I'd paid for every panel on that roof, wired every part of that system myself, and I knew exactly how much current was supposed to move in and out. When the math stopped adding up, my suspicion kicked in. So I decided to catch whoever was behind it. One night, I sat by the window with a mug of coffee, blinds cracked just enough to see outside. Hours crawled by in silence. Then, a little after midnight, a shadow slipped across my driveway. And there he was, the self-proclaimed HOA watchdog himself. Not in any official vehicle, not with a clipboard or citation pad, but dragging a thick orange charging cable behind him like it was his birthright. He strolled straight up to my outlet, plugged it in without a second thought, and casually leaned against his gleaming car while my electricity poured straight into his battery. That's when it clicked. This wasn't laziness. This was deliberate. This was a man wielding fake authority like a weapon, treating my property as if it were a public utility built for his convenience. And I wasn't about to let it slide. The next morning, I confronted him out in the open. He was swaggering down the street, wearing that ridiculous vest with HOA Patrol slapped across the back, as if it gave him some kind of legal power. I walked right up to him and said, "I saw you plugging your EV into my system last night. You're stealing my electricity." He didn't blink. He just smirked, adjusted his sunglasses, and replied, "Local housing guidelines allow emergency charging. I'm fully authorized to draw from community power sources." I almost burst out laughing right there. Community power sources? My solar grid wasn't some neighborhood project. I'd bought every panel, installed every wire, and paid every cent myself. And there sure as hell wasn't any clause that allowed a wannabe enforcer with a made-up title to leech off my setup. But the audacity didn't stop there. Night after night, he crept back. Sometimes he'd even park his car just far enough down the drive to make it look like he wasn't connected, as if that would keep me from noticing. Other nights, he was even bolder, standing there in plain view like some sort of monarch, daring me to challenge him. Kilowatts vanished into his car, and every single morning, my system logs showed the evidence. That's when I made up my mind. I wasn't going to waste another breath arguing. I wasn't going to plead or threaten. I was going to make sure he learned a lesson he'd never forget. If you're hooked on this HOA drama so far, hit that like button and stick around, because this is where things start to heat up. First step, I contacted the county's energy compliance office. They confirmed exactly what I already suspected. By law, nobody could tap into my private power system without my explicit consent. In fact, what he was doing qualified as theft of services, legally equivalent to siphoning gasoline or stealing cable. And with that confirmation, I had the green light to take action. I turned my attention to my setup. My inverter had advanced settings most people never touch, including voltage calibration. Under normal circumstances, it's tuned for stable, appliance-safe power. But with a few careful adjustments, I could change that. If someone tried to connect without the proper grounding, they'd get a surge. Not dangerous, not illegal, but enough to fry unprotected circuits. I also installed a discrete camera aimed directly at the outlet, insurance, in case he tried to deny everything later. Then I waited. Sure enough, the following night, twin headlights swept across my blinds. His Tesla glided up silently, smooth as always. He climbed out, casually plugged into my outlet like he owned it, and leaned against the hood while my system started feeding his battery. What he didn't realize was that this time, the setup was different. I sat quietly on my porch in the dark, coffee steaming in my hand, watching the scene unfold like a late-night thriller. The self-appointed enforcer stood there with his chest puffed out, completely oblivious as his car drew power from my grid. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. The charge indicator blinked in a steady rhythm. The charging light glowed a calm, steady blue for a moment. Then my system flipped the switch on the little surprise I'd built in. A faint vibration started up, so soft it was almost imperceptible. Seconds later, the Tesla's charging port let off a sharp spark. The cool blue light shifted to a furious, blinking red. He scowled, crouched down to investigate, and that's when it happened. Pop. A burst of white light spat from the port, followed by a violent crackle. The car's alarm system exploded into the quiet night, shrieking loud enough to wake the whole street. "What the?" he shouted, stumbling backward. I couldn't help myself, I called out, laughing just loud enough for him to hear. His head whipped around, fury blazing in his eyes. "You did this! You rigged the system!" I stood slowly, calm and deliberate. "No, I defended what's mine. You've been draining my power for weeks. Now you're just dealing with the consequences." He stormed toward me, fists balled tight. "I'll have you arrested. You can't tamper with an HOA officer's property." That one nearly made me burst out laughing. I held up my phone. "First off, you're not a law officer. Second, you just admitted on camera to stealing utilities." I tilted the screen so the small red recording light was impossible to miss. His face drained of color. But instead of retreating, he doubled down. He yanked out his own phone and dialed Karen, the HOA president. Within 10 minutes, her SUV rolled into my driveway. She stepped out like she was stepping onto a throne. "This is harassment," she barked before her heels even hit the pavement. "You can't tamper with a member's vehicle." He was performing official HOA duties. "Official duties?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "By plugging his car into my private solar grid?" Karen folded her arms, her tone dripping with arrogance. "The HOA retains access to all communal resources. That includes your property when deemed necessary." That was the final straw. The stupidity was so over the top, I nearly laughed out loud. Almost. I reached for my second phone, the one I'd used to call the sheriff's office the moment that car alarm started wailing. Right on cue, 2 squad cars rolled up, red and blue lights painting the yard in color. The real officers stepped out, hands resting on their duty belts. "We received a report of service theft and trespassing," one deputy said. "Who's the property owner here?" I raised my hand. That would be me. The self-appointed enforcer immediately pointed my way. "He sabotaged my vehicle. He's the criminal." Karen's voice climbed an octave. "Yes, arrest him immediately." But the deputies weren't having it. I handed the deputies my evidence, crystal clear footage of him walking onto my property, plugging into my outlet, draining power, and triggering the surge. They watched the recording in silence, nodding to one another. "Looks like theft of utilities," one officer said. "And trespassing. He clearly entered without permission." Karen tried to cut in, but the deputy shut her down instantly. "Ma'am, HOA policies don't supersede state law or property rights. You're not exempt from the law." By the time the night was over, Mr. HOA enforcer was slapped with citations for theft of services and trespassing. And Karen, who had been loudly defending him, faced an obstruction charge for interfering with the investigation. As the patrol cars pulled away, hauling them both off, the Tesla sat dead and lifeless in my driveway, its battery fried beyond repair. But the real fireworks came later. I filed a civil lawsuit against the wannabe officer for theft of utilities, calculating every single kilowatt hour he had siphoned. The court sided with me and awarded over $50,000 in damages, more than enough to rebuild my solar system twice over. Karen's downfall was swift. Humiliated, broke, and publicly disgraced, she was voted off the HOA board and forced to sell her home at a loss. And the ripple effect didn't stop there. The HOA itself came under investigation, lost its charter, and was dissolved permanently. As for me, my lights stayed bright, my solar grid remained mine, and the peace that had been stolen from my neighborhood finally returned. I sat back on my porch with one last sip of coffee, smiling as the fading flash of police lights disappeared down the street. This